my friend's uncle, and the woman in the alley. So I never really post on here, but something my friend told me about his uncle has been keeping me up at night. I need to share it somewhere because it's seriously messing with my head. This all happened in this small factory town in Pennsylvania where my friend's family is from. His uncle James, 54, is this totally normal guy who works as a supervisor at one of the manufacturing plants there. The kind of dude who watches football on weekends, drinks beer with his buddies, and rolls his eyes whenever someone brings up ghost stories or paranormal stuff. He's always been the practical type who needs to see something to believe it. About 2 months ago, James was working late at the factory. There had been some issues with the machinery, and as the supervisor, he needed to stay behind and make sure everything was fixed before the morning shift. By the time he finished, it was already past midnight. Now, James usually takes the main road home, but that night he was exhausted and just wanted to get home quicker. There's this shortcut through some old industrial area with abandoned warehouses that cuts like 15 minutes off his walk. Most people avoid it because it's sketchy and dark, but James figured it would be fine just this once. The shortcut is basically this narrow alley between 2 rows of old brick buildings. Most of the streetlights there don't work, and the ones that do flicker a lot. My friend says his uncle described it as the kind of place that makes you walk faster without even realizing it. James was about halfway through the alley when he noticed someone standing ahead of him. At first, he thought about turning back, worried it might be someone looking to mug him. But as he got closer, he realized it was a woman in a long white dress. According to James, she looked to be in her early 30s, pale skin, dark hair. Nothing particularly strange about her appearance, except for the fact that she was wearing this formal-looking white dress in an abandoned alley past midnight. She looked at him and asked in this really soft voice, "Would you mind walking with me? I'm scared to walk alone." James said her voice sounded weird, like it was coming from somewhere else, even though she was standing right in front of him. Being the decent guy he is, James agreed to walk with her. He figured maybe she was lost or something. As they walked, she stayed a few steps ahead of him. She didn't talk much, just kept looking back over her shoulder occasionally, as if checking that he was still there. The weird thing was, according to James, the temperature seemed to drop significantly when he was near her. It was September, so the nights were getting cooler, but this felt different, like the kind of cold that gets into your bones. When they reached the end of the alley, she just stopped and stared at the street ahead. James asked if she needed help getting somewhere, but she just smiled and said, "This is far enough for tonight. Thank you." Then she just walked away, disappearing around a corner before James could say anything else. James didn't think much of it at first, just a strange encounter with someone possibly not all there mentally. But the next night, he had to work late again, and against his better judgment, he took the same shortcut. And there she was again, same spot. Only this time, she was wearing all black. "You came back," she said, like she had been expecting him. "I knew you would." James said his heart nearly stopped. He hadn't planned to take the shortcut again. It was just a last-minute decision because he was tired. How could she have known? This time, as they walked, she kept closer to him. James said the air around her felt ice cold, and he could see his breath even though it wasn't that cold of a night. About halfway through the alley, she stopped and turned to him. "I have something for you," she said. She held out her hand, and in her palm was a simple silver ring with some kind of symbol etched into it. "Take it," she insisted. "It will protect you. It will make your life better." James refused. He didn't want anything from this strange woman. But she kept insisting, following him closely, holding the ring out. "You need this," she kept saying. "More than you know." Finally, James just bolted. He ran the rest of the way through the alley and didn't stop until he reached the main road. When he looked back, she was gone. Over the next week, James took the long way home, but one night, about a week later, there was an accident on the main road that blocked his usual route. The only way home without adding an hour to his walk was through the alley. James told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just some weird, possibly mentally ill woman. Nothing supernatural. So he took the alley again. She was there. Same spot. This time in a gray dress. But something was different about her. Her skin looked paler, almost translucent, and her eyes seemed darker, sunken in. "You didn't take my gift," she said, her voice now sounding hollow. "I've been waiting for you to come back." James tried to walk past her, but she stepped in front of him. "You need the ring," she said. "It's the only way." "The only way for what?" James asked. She just smiled this really unnerving smile. "You'll see." James pushed past her and started walking quickly. She followed behind him, always maintaining the same distance. James said he could hear her footsteps, but they didn't sound right. They were too quiet, like she was barely touching the ground. When they reached the end of the alley, she stopped just like before. James looked back and saw her standing there, just at the edge of where the alley meets the street. She held out the ring again. "Last chance," she said. James just shook his head and walked away. But as he was leaving, he heard her say, "I'll wait for you, every night." True to her word, she was there every night for the next week. James would see her standing in the alley as he walked past on the main road, always in the same spot, always watching him. Sometimes she'd have the ring held out in her palm. Other times, she'd just stare. After about 2 weeks of this, James started feeling sick. At first, it was just fatigue and chills. Then he developed a fever that wouldn't go away. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. Tests came back negative for flu, COVID, everything they could think of. One night, delirious with fever, James got confused on his way home from a doctor's appointment and accidentally wandered into the alley. She was there, of course. But this time, she looked almost transparent, like a fog you could see through. "You're dying," she said matter-of-factly. "The ring would have protected you." James tried to run, but he was too weak. He collapsed right there in the alley. He said the last thing he remembers is her standing over him, placing the ring on his chest. "Too late now?" she whispered. Some teenagers found him a few hours later and called an ambulance. He was hospitalized with a dangerously high fever for nearly a week. The ring was nowhere to be found when he was discovered. James recovered physically, but my friend says his uncle is not the same. He refuses to go anywhere near that part of town now. He changed jobs just so he wouldn't have to risk seeing that alley again. He still gets these weird fevers that come and go, and doctors can't explain it. The creepiest part? My friend went to visit his uncle last month. While he was there, he decided to check out this infamous alley himself during daylight. At the exact spot where James said he first met the woman, my friend found old newspaper articles plastered on the brick wall. They were all about a woman who had died in that alley back in the 1980s. She had been mugged and stabbed while walking home. The article mentioned she was wearing a white dress because she had been at a formal event. And get this, in her obituary, there was a mention of a family heirloom that went missing when she died. A silver ring with an ancient protection symbol that had been in her family for generations. James swears he never knew about this woman or the story before his encounters. He's a rational guy who doesn't believe in ghosts. But he can't explain what happened to him. Sometimes, my friend says, his uncle wakes up in the middle of the night feeling like someone is standing next to his bed. And on those nights, the room is always ice cold, no matter how high he turns up the heat. I don't know what to make of all this. I've always been on the fence about supernatural stuff, but the way my friend tells it, his uncle is too practical to make something like this up. And that fever that keeps coming back? Doctors are still baffled. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this, or heard of ghosts trying to give people objects? I've been researching but haven't found much. Part of me thinks there's a logical explanation, but another part, I don't know. I just know I'm never taking shortcuts through abandoned alleys ever again. The school trip that still haunts me. I never thought I'd be posting something like this on Reddit, but I need to get this off my chest. Everything I'm about to tell you happened during my senior year in high school, about 2 years ago. I've tried therapy, talking to my parents, even medication for the nightmares, but nothing helps. Maybe writing it all down will. It was supposed to be a normal senior trip. Our AP biology class was heading to this research station in the Appalachian Mountains to study local ecosystems or whatever. I wasn't really into the science part. I was just happy to get away from school for a few days, you know? There were 23 of us students plus Ms. Hernandez and Mr. Calloway as chaperones. The trip started normal enough. We left early Thursday morning on this old school bus that smelled like feet and had those uncomfortable green vinyl seats that stick to your legs when it's hot. Most of us were half asleep for the first couple hours, But then we started getting into the mountains. If you've never been to the Appalachians, there's something about them that feels different from other mountains. They're older, I guess, more worn down. The forests are super thick, and the fog hangs between the trees like it's alive. Even during the day, the sunlight has trouble breaking through in some places. We were about an hour away from the research station when the bus made this horrible grinding noise. The driver pulled over, and after a bunch of adults huddling around the engine and making concerned faces, Mr. Calloway told us the transmission was shot. We weren't going anywhere. The nearest town was called Elk Ridge, this tiny place that basically consisted of a gas station, a diner, and a motel called the Pine View. There was no cell service, so Mr. Calloway had to use the driver's radio to call for help. The mechanic in town said he couldn't get the parts until morning, so there we were, stuck in the middle of nowhere. Ms. Hernandez managed to book all the rooms at the Pine View Motel. It wasn't the worst place I've ever stayed, but it definitely wasn't great either. The wallpaper was this faded floral pattern that might have been cute in the 70s, and everything smelled faintly of cigarettes and pine sol. Me and my best friends Mason and Ryan bunked together. We'd been tight since freshman year, did everything together. Mason was the smart one, always calculating risks. Ryan was the wild one, always getting us into trouble. I was somewhere in the middle, I guess. After dinner at the diner, which was actually pretty good, the locals were nice enough, we were all hanging out in the motel parking lot when Ryan noticed something through a break in the trees. "Yo, Aiden Mason, check that out," he said, pointing to what looked like a small lake or pond about half a mile through the woods. The setting sun was reflecting off it, making it shine like a mirror between the trees. "We should go check it out," Ryan said with that look in his eyes that usually meant trouble. "No way," Mason replied. "We're supposed to stay at the motel, plus it'll be dark soon." "Come on," Ryan groaned. "We're seniors. This is supposed to be our big trip before graduation. Instead, we're stuck in this dump. Let's at least make it interesting." I was torn. Mason was right that we should stay put, but Ryan had a point too. This was our last school trip together, and so far it had been a complete bust. "We could just go for like an hour," I suggested. "No one will even notice we're gone." Mason rolled his eyes but eventually gave in. That was usually how it went with us. Ryan would suggest something crazy, I'd back him up, and Mason would reluctantly come along to make sure we didn't do anything too stupid. We waited until everyone settled into their rooms, and the teachers did their room check at 10 p.m. Then we snuck out through our ground floor window. It was easy enough. We'd done the same thing last year on our trip to Six Flags. The night was clear but moonless, making it darker than we expected. We used our phone flashlights to guide us toward the lake. The forest was dense, with trees growing so close together in some places that we had to squeeze between trunks. There was this weird silence too. No crickets, no frogs, no birds. Just the sound of our breathing and twigs snapping under our feet. "Does anyone else think it's weird how quiet it is?" Mason whispered after we'd been walking for about 15 minutes. "Probably just too cold for the bugs," I said, though it wasn't actually that cold for April. "I heard sometimes animals go quiet when there's a predator around," Ryan said with a laugh, clearly trying to spook us. "Shut up, man," Mason snapped. "That's not funny." As we got closer to the lake, a fog started rolling in, making it harder to see. Our flashlight beams just reflected back at us, creating this weird halo effect. I was starting to think this wasn't such a good idea after all. "Guys, maybe we should head back," I suggested. "I can barely see anything." "We're almost there," Ryan insisted. "I can smell the water." He was right. There was a damp, earthy smell in the air that reminded me of fishing trips with my dad. But there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite place. A metallic tinge, like old pennies. We pushed through a final thicket of bushes, and suddenly the trees opened up to reveal the lake. It was bigger than it had looked from the motel, maybe a quarter mile across. The water was completely still, like black glass reflecting the few stars visible through the fog. On the far side, I could just make out what looked like an old dock, and maybe some kind of structure. "See? Told you it would be cool," Ryan said, stepping toward the water's edge. "Don't get too close," Mason warned. "We don't know how deep it is." Ryan ignored him, crouching down to touch the water. "It's warm," he said, sounding surprised. Like bathwater. That didn't make sense. It was April in the mountains. The water should have been freezing. Let's walk around it a bit, Ryan suggested, already starting to follow the shoreline. I want to see what's on the other side. Mason and I followed, our flashlights bobbing in the dark. As we walked, I started noticing weird stuff along the shore. What looked like old children's toys half buried in the mud, a single shoe, a broken fishing pole. Normal stuff for a lake, I guess, but something about the way they were arranged felt deliberate, like someone had placed them there. After walking for about 10 minutes, we realized we'd gotten separated from Ryan. 1 minute he was a few feet ahead of us, and the next, his flashlight was gone. "Ryan!" Mason called out, his voice echoing across the water. "This isn't funny, man." No response. "He's probably just trying to scare us," I said, though I didn't believe it. Ryan liked pranks, but disappearing in the woods at night went beyond his usual stunts. We kept walking, calling Ryan's name every few seconds. The fog was getting thicker, and I was struggling to even see Mason, who was just a few feet away from me. Then my flashlight caught something moving in the trees about 20 yards inland from the shore. "Ryan?" I called out, pointing my light at the movement. It wasn't Ryan. It was a person, but they were kneeling on the ground, doing something with their hands. Digging, it looked like. "Hey!" Mason shouted, walking toward the figure. "Have you seen our friend?" As we got closer, I realized with a surge of relief that it was Ryan. He was on his knees, frantically digging at the dirt with his bare hands. "Dude, what are you doing?" I asked, reaching for his shoulder. When he turned to look at us, I nearly dropped my phone. Ryan's eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like liquid tar had filled the sockets. His face was expressionless, almost slack. "I need to dig," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his at all. It was deeper, raspier, like his vocal cords had been damaged. "Ryan, stop messing around," Mason said, grabbing his arm. "This isn't funny." Ryan jerked his arm away with such force that Mason stumbled backward and fell. "I need to dig," Ryan shouted, his black eyes wide and unblinking. Then, as suddenly as it had started, Ryan collapsed face first into the dirt hole he'd been digging. "What the hell?" I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mason scrambled to his feet, and we both rushed to Ryan. I rolled him over, half expecting to see those black eyes again, but they were closed. He was breathing, but unresponsive. "We need to get him back to the motel," Mason said, trying to lift Ryan up. "Something's wrong with him." As we struggled to get Ryan to his feet, he suddenly jerked awake, gasping like he'd been underwater. His eyes fluttered open, normal eyes, his usual hazel color, and he looked around in confusion. "What happened?" he asked, his voice back to normal. "Why am I covered in dirt?" Before we could answer, Mason made a choking sound and dropped to his knees, clutching his head. I watched in horror as his eyes rolled back and then refilled with that same black substance that had taken over Ryan's. "Mason?" Ryan asked, backing away. "What's wrong with him?" Mason didn't respond. He got to his feet with jerky movements like a puppet on strings and started walking into the woods, away from the lake. "We have to follow him," I said, helping Ryan up. "Something is seriously wrong." Ryan was disoriented but able to walk. He claimed he had no memory of digging or his eyes changing. The last thing he remembered was walking ahead of us by the lake, then feeling cold all over, like he'd been dunked in ice water. We followed Mason's flashlight through the trees. He was moving fast with a purpose, never looking back to see if we were following. After about 10 minutes, we came to a small clearing, and in the center was a house. It wasn't just any house. It was old. Like, really old. The kind of place that should have collapsed decades ago. The wooden siding was rotted and falling off in places. Most of the windows were broken, and the front porch sagged in the middle like it might give way at any moment. It was the kind of place you'd walk a mile out of your way to avoid. Mason walked right up to the front door and went inside without hesitation. "We can't go in there," Ryan whispered. "That place looks like it's about to fall down." "We can't leave Mason," I insisted, though every instinct was screaming at me to run back to the motel. We approached the house slowly. Up close, it was even worse than it had looked from a distance. The wood was soft and spongy under my hand as I pushed the door open wider. The smell hit me immediately. Rot and mold and something else. Something sickly sweet that made my stomach turn. "Mason?" I called out. my voice barely above a whisper. Our flashlights revealed a living room filled with ancient, decaying furniture. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a set of footprints, Mason's, leading through the room and up a staircase. "I don't like this, Aiden," Ryan said, gripping my arm. "Something's really wrong here." "I know," I replied, "but we can't leave him." We followed the footprints up the stairs, each step creaking loudly under our weight. At the top was a hallway with 3 doors. The middle door was open, and that's where Mason's footprints led. I took a deep breath and peered inside. It was a bedroom, with an old iron bed frame and a dresser with a cracked mirror. And there was Mason, standing in the middle of the room, staring at the ceiling. But he wasn't just standing. He was floating, his feet about 6 inches off the floor. "Mason?" I whispered, my voice cracking. His head snapped toward us, those black eyes fixing on mine. But it wasn't Mason looking at me. Whatever was behind those eyes wasn't human. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in that same raspy voice Ryan had used earlier. "She doesn't like visitors." "Who doesn't like visitors?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. As if in answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face. The mirrors on the dresser cracked further, splintering outward like a spider web. And then I saw her, reflected in the broken mirror. An old woman standing in the corner behind us, though when I whipped around to look, there was nothing there. But in the mirror, she was clear as day. Wild gray hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed in years. Skin so pale it was almost blue, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. And her eyes. Hollow, black voids, just like Mason's and Ryan's had been. "Run," I whispered to Ryan, backing toward the door. "We need to run, now." But Ryan was frozen, staring at the mirror. "I can see her," he said. "She's right behind us." I grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the door. As we turned to run, I saw movement in the corner of the room. The old woman was no longer just in the mirror. She was there, in the flesh, crouched in the corner like an animal. And she was moving toward us, not walking but crawling along the floor, her movements jerky and unnatural, too fast for someone so old and frail looking. We bolted out of the room and down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I could hear something following us, a rapid scrabbling sound like too many legs on the wooden floor. We burst out of the house and ran blindly into the woods, no longer caring about the path, just desperate to get away. Behind us, I heard Mason scream, a sound so full of pain and terror that it still echoes in my nightmares. Somehow, we ended up back at the lake. The fog had cleared somewhat, and the water was no longer still. It was churning, like something beneath the surface was stirring it up. "We need to go back for Mason," Ryan gasped, bending over with his hands on his knees. Before I could respond, Ryan straightened up suddenly, his eyes wide with fear. "She's here," he whispered. I turned to look behind us, expecting to see the old woman from the house, but there was nothing there. When I turned back, Ryan was walking into the lake. "Ryan, stop!" I shouted, reaching for him, but he was already waist deep in the water. "I can't stop," he said, his voice oddly calm. "She's calling me." I waded in after him, the warm water soaking through my jeans and shoes. I managed to grab his arm when he was chest deep, but it was like trying to hold onto a statue. He kept moving forward with a strength I couldn't counter. "Please, Ryan," I begged. "Don't do this. Fight it." For a moment, his eyes cleared, and I saw recognition there. He looked terrified. "Aiden," he gasped. "I can feel her pulling me down. Help me." I tightened my grip, trying to drag him back to shore, but suddenly something yanked him under the surface. The water closed over his head without even a splash, like he'd simply ceased to exist. I dove under trying to find him, but the water was pitch black and much deeper than a small lake should be. It felt like I was swimming in an ocean trench, the bottom impossibly far away. When my lungs started burning, I had to surface. I searched the water for any sign of Ryan, screaming his name until my voice gave out. Eventually, I staggered back to shore, soaking wet and in shock. I don't remember much after that. I have flashes of wandering through the woods, calling for my friends, falling down a few times. At some point, I must have made it back to the motel, because the next thing I clearly remember is waking up in our room to the sound of sirens. The motel parking lot was full of police cars and an ambulance. Mr. Calloway was talking to a police officer, gesturing wildly, his face pale. When I stumbled outside, still in my wet clothes from the night before, Ms. Hernandez rushed over to me. "Aiden, where have you been? Where are Mason and Ryan?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. I couldn't speak. My teeth were chattering, not from cold, but from shock. Over Ms. Hernandez's shoulder, I saw two officers coming out of the woods. They were carrying something on a stretcher, covered with a white sheet. Behind them was another stretcher, also covered. One of the sheets had slipped slightly, revealing a pale hand with dirt under the fingernails. Mason's hand. I recognized the friendship bracelet his little sister had made him last summer. I broke down then, collapsing onto the pavement. The next few hours are still a blur. I remember being questioned by police, trying to explain what happened but knowing how insane it all sounded. I told them about the lake and the house, but when officers went to investigate, they said there was no house in the area I described. The lake was there, but it was normal, cold, not warm, and only about 10 feet at its deepest point. They found Mason's body in the woods, not far from where we'd seen Ryan digging. The official cause of death was exposure and heart failure, though the coroner apparently couldn't explain why a healthy 18-year-old's heart would just stop. Ryan's body was found floating in the lake the next day. The ruling was accidental drowning, but I know what really happened, and apparently so did some of the locals. While I was waiting for my parents to drive up from Charleston, an old man who worked at the gas station approached me. He looked around nervously before speaking. "That lake," he said in a low voice. "You kids went there at night, didn't you?" I nodded, too exhausted to lie. "There's a story about that place," he continued. "Back in the 1950s, there was this old woman who lived alone in a cabin near the lake. Eliza Blackwood. People in town thought she was a witch or something, practiced black magic. Kids would dare each other to go throw rocks at her windows." He paused, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. One day, a group of drunk hunters decided to teach her a lesson. Things got out of hand. They killed her, then panicked and threw her body in the lake. The lake wasn't even there before she died. The story goes that it formed overnight after they dumped her, like the ground just sank and filled with water. The police ruled it an accident, but everyone knew what happened. Ever since then, people who go near that lake at night sometimes don't come back. The ones who do, well, they're never the same. He took a long drag of his cigarette. They say she pulls them in, uses them somehow, like she's trying to come back. I didn't say anything. What could I say? But I think he saw in my face that I believed him. "I'm sorry about your friends," he said, crushing out his cigarette. "But count yourself lucky. She usually takes everyone who sees her." My parents arrived a few hours later and took me home. I didn't go back to school that year. Couldn't face the empty seats where my best friend should have been. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to convince myself that what happened was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by getting lost in the woods at night. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm taking a shower or washing dishes, I'll look down at the water and see a face looking back up at me. An old woman with hollow black eyes and a hungry smile. I still don't know why she let me live when she took Mason and Ryan. Maybe she's not done with me yet. Maybe she's still waiting for me to come back to that lake. But I never will. I'll never set foot in the Appalachian Mountains again. If you're ever driving through and your car breaks down near a small town called Elk Ridge, find another place to stay. Don't go near the lake. Don't go into the woods at night. And if you see an old house that looks like it should have collapsed years ago, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because she's still there, waiting, and she's always hungry for more. The Backroad. Through Pine Hollow. I never believed in ghosts before that night on Route 177. Now, I can't sleep without the lights on. It happened 3 weeks ago. My best friend Mike and I were driving back from a weekend trip to the mountains. We'd been at a music festival, some underground thing that Mike had heard about from his cousin. The festival itself was pretty boring, just a bunch of hipsters with bad sound equipment in a clearing. We left around 8 p.m., earlier than planned. Dude, we can still make it back to Portland by midnight if we push it, Mike said, checking Google Maps. The suggested route showed a highway cutting through Pine Hollow State Forest. It looked shorter than the main road we'd taken to get there. I don't know, man. That road doesn't look like a major route, I replied, peering at his phone. It's marked as a state highway. Plus, it'll save us like an hour and a half. Come on, I have that job interview tomorrow afternoon. I should have said no. I should have insisted we take the longer route. But Mike was my best friend since high school, and he really needed that job. He'd been unemployed for 6 months after his startup collapsed, and his parents were putting pressure on him to get a real job. This interview at a tech company downtown was his best chance in weeks. Fine, but I'm driving, I said, holding out my hand for the keys to his beat-up Honda Civic. Mike tossed me the keys without argument. He was already tired from driving us up to the mountains on Friday, and I could see the dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well lately. The stress of the job hunt was getting to him. We packed up our small tent and sleeping bags, tossed them in the trunk, and hit the road. The sun was already setting as we pulled away from the festival grounds, casting long shadows across the narrow mountain road. The first hour was fine. The road was decent, 2 lanes, some potholes, but nothing unusual for a secondary highway in Oregon. We had music playing, Mike was scrolling through Instagram, and I was focused on the road. We stopped briefly at a small roadside diner for some coffee and burgers. The old man running the place gave us a strange look when Mike mentioned we were taking the forest route. Not good at night, he said, shaking his head. Main road better. We ignored him. Locals always had some superstition or other about forests at night. Besides, the coffee was watery and the place looked unsanitary. We left quickly and continued on our way. The problem started when we entered the forest section around 10:30 p.m. The trees grew thicker on both sides, forming a dark tunnel that our headlights barely penetrated. The road narrowed, and the cell reception disappeared completely. Maps is gone, Mike said, tapping his phone screen uselessly. But we just keep straight on this road for another 25 miles. Then there should be an exit toward the interstate. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Something about the forest felt wrong. It was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the rumble of our car engine and the occasional bump as we hit another pothole. Mike tried to lighten the mood by connecting his phone to the car stereo and playing some old 90s rock we used to blast during our high school road trips. It worked for a while. We were halfway through a badly sung duet of Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit when the car stereo suddenly cut out, replaced by static. What the? Mike fiddled with his phone. That's weird. It's still showing as connected. He unplugged and replugged the aux cord, but the static continued, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. Forget it, I said, trying to hide my unease. Let's just focus on getting through this forest. Mike switched off the stereo and leaned back in his seat. For a few minutes, we drove in silence, the darkness of the forest pressing in on all sides. The headlights seemed to be getting dimmer, though I told myself it was just my imagination. Slow down, Mike suddenly said, pointing ahead. There's someone on the road. I squinted through the windshield. About 50 meters ahead, illuminated by our headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road. It looked like a young boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, wearing what seemed to be a Boy Scout uniform. Khaki shirt, dark shorts, the usual outfit you'd see at any scout meeting. What the hell is a kid doing out here at this time? I muttered, slowing the car down. As we got closer, I could see the boy more clearly. There was something off about him. His uniform was dirty and torn in places, and he was completely still, staring directly at our approaching car. His face was unnaturally pale, almost glowing in our headlights. Should we stop? Mike asked, already rolling down his window. In the middle of nowhere? At night? Are you crazy? I replied, but I was slowing down anyway. You can't just ignore a kid alone on a forest road at night. When we were about 20 meters away, the boy suddenly moved. He turned and darted into the trees on the right side of the road. Stop the car, Mike shouted. That kid needs help. Mike, this is weird, I protested, but I pulled over anyway. The car sputtered slightly as I brought it to a stop on the shoulder of the road. I noticed the temperature gauge on the dashboard was running higher than normal. Mike was already opening his door. I'm just going to check if he's okay. Maybe he's lost or something." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "Let's both go. I don't think we should split up here." Mike nodded, and we both got out of the car, leaving the headlights on and the engine running. I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the glove compartment. It was one of those heavy metal ones that could double as a weapon if needed. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring. The moment we stepped out of the car, the silence of the forest hit me like a physical force. There should have been some sounds: birds, insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But there was nothing, just the idling of our car engine, which itself seemed muffled somehow. The air felt strange too, heavy and cold, with an unpleasant metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies or blood. I shivered despite the warm July night. "Hello?" Mike called out. "Kid, are you okay? We can help you?" No response, just the unnatural silence of the forest. We took a few steps toward where we'd seen the boy disappear. The forest was dense, with undergrowth that grabbed at our ankles. The beam of the flashlight seemed swallowed by the darkness after just a few meters. "I don't like this," I whispered. "Maybe we should call the sheriff when we get to the next town." "And tell them what? That we saw a kid and did nothing?" Mike shot back. "Come on, 5 minutes. If we don't find him, we'll go." We pushed forward about 20 meters from the road when Mike spotted something. "There," he pointed. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of the scout uniform moving between trees ahead of us. We followed, calling out reassurances that we just wanted to help. The boy always stayed just at the edge of our vision, moving deeper into the forest. "Mike, this isn't right," I said, stopping. "We're getting too far from the car. We can't just leave him," Mike insisted, his face showing genuine concern that was so typical of him. He was always the better person between us. During college, he was the one who stopped to help accident victims when others drove by. He was the one who donated half his scholarship money to his neighbor so her daughter could afford cancer treatments. "Fine, 5 more minutes. Then we go back and call for help at the next town," I conceded. We continued forward, the forest getting thicker around us. The boy seemed to be following some kind of path that we couldn't see. After another few minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, rusted car wreck. It looked like it had been there for years, partially reclaimed by the forest. Vines and small plants grew through the windows and wheel wells. It was an old Ford station wagon, the kind families drove in the 80s. The boy was nowhere to be seen. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, moving toward the wreck. I followed reluctantly, sweeping the flashlight across the clearing. That's when I noticed the markings on the trees. Strange symbols carved into the bark, forming a circle around the clearing. They looked old, the edges of the carvings weathered and darkened with age. Some resembled Native American pictographs, but distorted, wrong somehow. "Mike, we need to leave, now!" My voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Mike had reached the car wreck and was peering inside. "Jason, there's something in here." Against my better judgment, I joined him. The car's metal was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold for a summer night. The interior was mostly intact, though the leather seats were cracked and moldy. The dashboard was covered in a thick layer of dust except for one spot that looked recently wiped clean, a small area around the ignition. And then, in the back seat, was what Mike had seen. Inside the rusted shell of what might have once been a family station wagon was a small skeleton. A child's skeleton, wearing the tattered remains of what could have been a scout uniform. The bones were yellowed with age, but still held together in roughly the right position, as if the child had been sitting there, waiting for years. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "We're calling the police. Let's go back to the car." Mike nodded, his face pale in the flashlight beam. We turned to leave the clearing, and that's when we saw him again. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, but he looked different now. His skin was gray and mottled, his eyes completely black. The tears in his uniform revealed glimpses of bone. In the harsh beam of the flashlight, I could see through parts of him as if he wasn't fully there. "Mike," I whispered, "don't move." The boy's head tilted at an impossible angle, and then he smiled, a terrible wide smile that split his face unnaturally. "He wants us to help him," Mike said suddenly, his voice oddly flat. "He's been waiting for someone to help him." "What? Mike, that's not a real kid. We need to go." I hissed, grabbing his arm. His skin felt cold, almost as cold as the car had been. The boy took a step forward, and I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. He didn't disturb the undergrowth. Ferns and small plants passed through his legs as if he wasn't there. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Mike with me. We crashed through the undergrowth, not caring about the path, just trying to get back to the road. I could hear something moving behind us, faster than a child should be able to move through dense forest. The sound wasn't of footsteps, but a sort of slithering rustle, punctuated by what sounded like dry bones clicking together. Mike was ahead of me, his longer legs giving him more speed. The road had to be close, but in the panic, I'd lost all sense of direction. My lungs burned, and branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts. Then I heard Mike scream. It was a sound I'll never forget. Terror and pain mixed into something primal. I burst through a thicket and saw him on the ground, the boy thing on top of him. In the dim beam of the now failing flashlight, I could see the boy's hands. No longer hands, but elongated, bony appendages, sunk deep into Mike's chest. Mike's eyes found mine, filled with shock and a silent plea for help. His mouth opened and closed, blood bubbling at the corners. The boy thing's head swiveled 180 degrees to look at me, that same terrible smile splitting its face. I should have run to him. I should have tried to save him. Instead, I turned and ran, Mike's screams following me until they suddenly cut off. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. By some miracle, I found the road, and our car was still there, engine running. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed on the accelerator, tires squealing on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw the boy standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. For a split second, I could have sworn he looked normal again, just a sad, lost child in a dirty scout uniform. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest sheriff's station in a small town about 20 miles away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the car, and I had to pull over twice to vomit on the side of the road. Every shadow in the trees looked like that boy, watching me, waiting. The sheriff's station was a small brick building with a flagpole out front and just 2 patrol cars in the lot. Deputy Wilson was at the desk when I burst in, wild-eyed and babbling. "Slow down, son," he said, setting aside his coffee. "What happened?" I tried to explain about the boy, the car wreck, what happened to Mike. The words tumbled out in a confused mess. Deputy Wilson looked increasingly skeptical as I spoke. "You're saying a ghost killed your friend?" he asked, not bothering to hide his disbelief. "I know how it sounds," I said, desperate. "But Mike is still out there. We need to go find him. Please." They didn't believe me at first. Just another college kid with an overactive imagination, they thought. Or worse, they suspected I had done something to Mike and was concocting this wild story as a cover. It was only when I showed them the GPS location on my phone, which had miraculously regained signal as soon as I left the forest, and offered to lead them back to the spot that they reluctantly agreed to investigate. They probably thought they'd find nothing, or at best, evidence that would incriminate me. A young deputy named Rodriguez was assigned to drive with me back to the forest, while 2 others followed in a sheriff's SUV. Rodriguez kept his hand near his holstered gun the entire ride, watching me from the corner of his eye. I couldn't blame him. I wouldn't have believed my story either. It was nearly dawn by the time we reached the stretch of road where Mike and I had seen the boy. In the gray light of early morning, the forest looked ordinary, almost benign. Birds were singing, and a light mist hung between the trees. "It was right here," I said, pointing to the spot where we'd pulled over. The skid marks from my hasty departure were still visible on the asphalt. Rodriguez and the other deputies exchanged glances. "Show us where you went into the forest," Rodriguez said, his tone making it clear he still thought this was a waste of time. I led them into the trees, trying to retrace our steps from the night before. In daylight, the forest was different. Landmark trees I remembered looked wrong. Paths I thought we'd taken didn't exist. After 20 minutes of wandering, Rodriguez was losing patience. "Sir, if this is some kind of joke," he began. "There," I interrupted, pointing ahead. Through a gap in the trees, I could see the clearing with the rusted car. The deputies pushed past me, hands on their weapons. As we entered the clearing, I heard one of them mutter, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. The car was there, just as I remembered it. But in daylight, it looked older, more decayed. The clearing was littered with beer cans and cigarette butts, evidence that local teenagers used this spot for drinking, something I hadn't noticed in the dark. And there, a few meters from the car, was Mike's body. Rodriguez gestured for me to stay back while the deputies approached cautiously. I caught glimpses of Mike between them. He was lying face up, eyes open and staring at the sky. His chest was a mess of deep puncture wounds, his shirt soaked with blood. "Call for backup and the medical examiner," Rodriguez ordered one of the other deputies, his voice now tense and professional. To me, he said, "You need to come to the station to make a formal statement." When they found Mike's body the next morning, exactly where I described, things changed. The police couldn't ignore the fact that something had killed my friend, something that had left 5 deep, strange puncture wounds in his chest. The investigation that followed was extensive, at least by the standards of a small-town sheriff's department. They brought in officers from the state police, forensic experts, even a team of forest rangers who knew the area. The car wreck yielded the first clue. The police investigation revealed that it had been there for over 15 years. Records showed it was registered to a local scout leader who had disappeared along with one of his scouts while driving home from a camping trip in 2007. The case had gone cold after months of searching yielded no results. The skeleton inside was identified through dental records as Tommy Blake, a local boy who had disappeared during that same scout trip. He was 12 years old when he vanished, the same age as the boy Mike and I had seen. The official theory is that Mike and I stumbled upon an old crime scene, and that I panicked and ran when Mike had some kind of accident or medical emergency. They speculated that the scout leader might have kidnapped the boy, crashed in the forest, and both died from injuries or exposure. But that didn't explain what killed Mike. The coroner couldn't explain the 5 deep puncture wounds in his chest. They were evenly spaced, about the width of a child's hand, but each hole was nearly 6 inches deep. No animal in the region makes marks like that, they said. They eventually ruled it as an animal attack, possibly a mountain lion, though no mountain lion has been spotted in that forest for decades. The case file remains open, labeled as an unexplained death. I'm still technically a person of interest, though they have no evidence to charge me with anything. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't an animal. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear Mike screaming again. And sometimes, when I look out my apartment window, I see a small figure in a scout uniform standing under the streetlight, looking up at me. The thing is, I can't help but wonder, why did it kill Mike and not me? What made it choose him? Or maybe the better question is, why did it let me go? I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to understand what happened that night. I took a leave of absence from work. My boss thinks I'm traumatized from finding my friend's body, which isn't entirely wrong. I've been researching, digging into local legends and history. I keep thinking about those symbols carved into the trees. I've been trying to identify them, comparing them to ancient scripts and occult symbols. A professor at Oregon State's anthropology department reluctantly told me they resembled a corrupted form of Native American symbols, specifically those related to spirit trapping and the boundary between worlds. And I found something else, an old local legend about a forest ghost, the spirit of a child who lures travelers into the woods. The stories go back at least a century, with reports of a child seen on lonely roads at night, especially in that region. They say it needs a new soul every few years to remain in our world. They say if you see a child alone on a forest road at night, you should never stop your car, never get out, never follow. I wish someone had told us this before we took that shortcut through Pine Hollow. Mike's funeral was last week. His parents are devastated, unable to understand how their son could be here one day and gone the next. They look at me strangely now. They don't blame me directly, but I can see the questions in their eyes. Why him? Why not you? I don't have answers for them. I can't tell them what really happened. Who would believe me? Yesterday, I visited the diner where Mike and I stopped for coffee before entering the forest. The old man recognized me from the news reports about Mike's death. He wasn't surprised. "I warned you," he said simply. "Forest road not good at night." When I pressed him for more information, he reluctantly told me a story. Years ago, a scout leader from the nearby town was rumored to be involved in occult practices. When a boy from his troop went missing during a camping trip, people became suspicious. Before they could question him properly, he disappeared along with another scout. Some say he sacrificed the first boy, and eventually the second, in dark rituals designed to give him power or long life. Some say he crashed his car trying to escape with his final victim. Either way, neither he nor the boy were ever seen alive again. But sometimes, people see a boy on the forest road at night. Those who stop never return. The boy is not the victim, the old man told me, his rheumy eyes serious. The boy is the trap. I left the diner with more questions than answers. If the old man's story is true, then the spirit I saw wasn't just the ghost of a murdered child. It was something darker, perhaps the instrument of the scout leader's unfinished ritual, or maybe something that was never human to begin with. I dream about Mike almost every night. In the dreams, he's still in that clearing, still pinned to the ground by that thing. But in the dreams, he's still alive, still screaming for help. And I'm still running away. The sheriff's department called yesterday. They're closing Mike's case, ruling it as death by animal attack despite the inconsistencies. They're tired of my stories about ghosts and rituals. They think I'm either crazy or hiding something. Maybe they're right about one thing. Maybe I am hiding something. Not from them, but from myself. There's something I haven't admitted. Something that haunts me more than the memory of that boy thing. In that moment when I saw Mike being attacked, when I made the decision to run instead of help, I felt relief. Relief that it was him, not me. What kind of person does that make me? I've started seeing things since that night. Glimpses of the boy in crowds, reflections in windows that don't match my movements. Last night, I woke to find my apartment filled with the smell of damp earth and rusted metal. My phone was open to Google Maps, with a route plotted back to that stretch of highway through Pine Hollow State Forest. I think it wants me to return. I think it's not finished with me yet. I'm writing this all down because I don't know how much longer I have. If you're reading this, please, I beg you, if you're driving at night and see a child alone on the road, especially near a forest, don't stop. Don't get out of your car. Don't follow. And if you're ever traveling through the mountains in Oregon, take the main road. No matter how much time you think you'll save, the shortcut through the forest isn't worth it. Mike learned that the hard way. And I think very soon I will too.